correctly. That's what becoming Jewish came to mean to all these people. And that's why anti-Judaism became a way of thinking about how you should, as a Christian or a Muslim, act in the world, how you could criticize other Christians, other Muslims for acting in the world, how you could criticize basically anything in the world as too Jewish, as Judaizing. Anti-Judaism in that sense became an ideal. It became a way of thinking about the good. Anti-Judaism is often a way of actually trying to reach our very highest ideals as a culture or a people. Let me give you an example, because it's really an interesting and a challenging example to my mind, and that's Shakespeare. Shakespeare writes a play that is today famous for its, some people call it anti-Semitic themes. I'm thinking, of course, of The Merchant of Venice and of its portrayal of Shylock. But what's interesting about Shakespeare from my point of view, that is from someone who's thinking about and interested in how a society uses Judaism to think about its world, even a society in which there are no Jews alive. In Shakespeare's England, there had not been living Jews, identified Jews, for hundreds of years, and there wouldn't be for a good deal longer. And yet, when Shakespeare is trying to think through some of the most challenging changes in his own time, he does so through figures of Judaism, namely Shylock. Now, what are some of those changes? There are things like the lending of money at interest suddenly became legal in Shakespeare's day. Shakespeare's father had gone to jail for lending money at interest, and lending money at interest had always been thought of as Judaizing, as something Jews did but not Christians. All of a sudden, it's legal. Well, what makes the difference between a Christian who lends money at interest and a Jew? That's one of the issues that The Merchant of Venice is constantly thinking through. And that's why it constantly repeats the line, what is the difference between merchant and Jew? Merchant is another example. Being a merchant in traditional medieval Catholicism was a stigmatized profession. The merchant cannot be a Christian, says Gratian's Decretum, which is one of the canon law codes of the Middle Ages. And now all of a sudden in England, in the 16th century, merchants are not only becoming incredibly rich, think of all the companies, the East India companies that have become so important, but also incredibly powerful in the Republic, and they're claiming an ever more important role in governing the Republic. Well, what differentiates the merchant from the moneylender, buy low, sell high kind of materialist that had previously been criticized as a Jew? Actually, theater is something new that Shakespeare has to think about. The first theater ticket sold for cash was sold in Shakespeare's own lifetime. He's part of a brand new profession in which people are basically selling falsity for money. Right? These are not morality plays. They're not about, they're all fun and falsity. And you can be sure that Christian moralists, both Protestant and Catholic, characterize the theater as Jewish. So how does Shakespeare think about the function of the theater and defend its function? Well, these are all things that he chose to do in The Merchant of Venice through a figure of Judaism, despite the fact, to repeat myself, that there were no Jews in Shakespeare's England. But they were still very good to think through all these issues. Hypocrisy had been, since the New Testament, identified with Judaism. Theater is a hypocritical art. It looks like one thing but is another. Money lending with Judaism. Materialism with Judaism. Legalism, the whole idea, a pound of flesh, the contract that Shylock keeps on invoking, this idea that when do you enforce law and when do you not enforce law? What are the limits of enforcing law? Shakespeare chose to explore all these things by contrasting a Christian figure with a Jewish figure in this play. That's a wonderful example to my mind of how a great artist, but I would say an entire culture, thinks with Judaism and imagines its responsibility to some degree to overcome Judaism, right? Which is what the play ends up doing. Shylock is defeated, even in an area in which there are no real Jews. So would I say that Shakespeare is anti-Semitic? I don't think that's a relevant question. Would I say that he's an expert in thinking through the possibilities for Judaism, and particularly for anti-Judaism, as a way of defining changes in his society and defining what the good or the Christian role in that society should be? Absolutely. He was one of the great masters in deploying anti-Judaism to that degree. So great that the figures he created had a life long after and affected real Jews. So, for example, Shylock became in many people's minds an image of a real Jew. And when, for example, the British Parliament was discussing in the 18th century what rights Jews should have, should they be citizens, etc., Exhibit A in the arguments of those who said no was, look at Shylock, look at how he treated a fellow citizen. You can't grant a person like that those kinds of rights.